to Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. Of Jesus College, Oxondear Knight, the manner of living at Harrogate was so agreeable to my disposition, that I left the place with some regret. Our Aunt Tabby would have probably made some objection to our departing so soon, had not an accident embroiled her with Mr. Micklewhimmen, the Scotch advocate, on whose heart she had been practising, from the second day after our arrival. That original, though seemingly precluded from the use of his limbs, had turned his genius to good account. In short, by dint of groaning and whining, he had excited the compassion of the company so effectually that an old lady, who occupied the very best apartment in the house, gave it up for his case and convenience. When his man led him into the long room, all the females were immediately in commotion. One set an elbow chair, another shook up the cushion, a third brought a stool, and a fourth a pillow, for the accommodation of his feet. Two ladies, of whom Tabby was always one, supported him into the dining room, and placed him properly at the table, and his taste was indulged with a succession of delicacies, culled by their fair hands. All this attention he repaid with a profusion of compliments and benedictions, which were not the less agreeable for being delivered in the Scottish dialect. As for Mrs. Tabitha, his respects were particularly addressed to her, and he did not fail to mingle them with religious reflections touching free grace, knowing her bias to Methodism, which he also professed upon a Calvinistical model. For my part, I could not help thinking this lawyer was not such an invalid as he pretended to be. I observed he ate very heartily 3 times a day, and though his bottle was marked stomachic tincture, he had recourse to it so often, and seemed to swallow it with such peculiar relish, that I suspected it was not compounded in the apothecary's shop, or the chemist's laboratory. One day, while he was earnest in discourse with Mrs. Tabitha, and his servant had gone out on some occasion or other, I dexterously exchanged the labels and situation of his bottle and mine, and having tasted his tincture, found it was excellent claret. I forthwith handed it about me to some of my neighbours, and it was quite emptied before Mr. Micklewhimmen had occasion to repeat his draught. At length, turning about, he took hold of my bottle, instead of his own, and, filling a large glass, drank to the health of Mrs. Tabitha. It had scarce touched his lips, when he perceived the change which had been put upon him, and was at first a little out of countenance. He seemed to retire within himself, in order to deliberate, and in half a minute his resolution was taken. Addressing himself to our quarter, "I give the gentleman credit for his wit," said he. "It was a good practical joke, but sometimes high Josai in Syria dukin mala. I hope for his own sake he has not drank all the liquor, for it was a vara powerful infusion of jalap in Bordeaux wine. At its possible he may ha' ta'en sic a dose as will produce a terrible catastrophe in his ein buels." By far the greater part of the contents had fallen to the share of a young clothier from Leeds, who had come to make a figure at Harrogate, and was, in effect, a great coxcomb in his way. It was with a view to laugh at his fellow guests, as well as to mortify the lawyer, that he had emptied the bottle, when it came to his turn, and he had laughed accordingly, but now his mirth gave way to his apprehension, he began to spit, to make wry faces, and writhe himself into various contortions. "Damn the stuff!" cried he, "I thought it had a villainous twang, paw. He that would cozen a Scot, mun get up betimes, and take old Scratch for his counsellor." "In troth, mester, what DCM," replied the lawyer, "your wit has run you into a filthy puddle. I'm truly consarned for your waeful case. The best advice I can give you, in sic a dilemma, is to send an express to Ripon for Dr. Waugh, without delay, and, in the meantime, swallow all the oil and butter you can find in the hoose, to defend your poor stomach and intestines from the vilification of the particles of the jalap, which is vara violent, even when taken in moderation." The poor clothier's torments had already begun. He retired, roaring with pain, to his own chamber. The oil was swallowed, and the doctor sent for, but before he arrived, the miserable patient had made such discharges upwards and downwards, that nothing remained to give him further offence, and this double evacuation was produced by imagination alone, for what he had drank was genuine wine of Bordeaux, which the lawyer had brought from Scotland for his own private use. The clothier, finding the joke turn out so expensive and disagreeable, quitted the house next morning, leaving the triumph to Micklewhimmen, who enjoyed it internally without any outward signs of exultation. On the contrary, he affected to pity the young man for what he had suffered, and acquired fresh credit from the shoe of moderation. It was about the middle of the night, which succeeded this adventure, that the vent of the kitchen chimney being foul, the soot took fire, and the alarm was given in a dreadful manner. Everybody leaped naked out of bed, and in a minute the whole house was filled with cries and confusion. There was 2 stairs in the house, and to these we naturally ran, but they were both so blocked up, by the people pressing one upon another, that it seemed impossible to pass, without throwing down and trampling upon the women. In the midst of this anarchy, Mr. Micklewhimmen, with a leathern portmanteau on his back, came running as nimble as a buck along the passage, and Tabby, in her under petticoat, endeavouring to hook him under the arm, that she might escape through his protection, he very fairly pushed her down, crying, "Na, na, good faith, charity begins at hame." Without paying the least respect to the shrieks and entreaties of his female friends, he charged through the midst of the crowd, overturning everything that opposed him, and actually fought his way to the bottom of the staircase. By this time Clinker had found a ladder by which he entered the window of my uncle's chamber, where our family was assembled, and proposed that we should make our exit successively by that conveyance. The squire exhorted his sister to begin the descent, but, before she could resolve, her woman, Mrs. Winifred Jenkins, in a transport of terror, threw herself out at the window upon the ladder, while Humphrey dropped upon the ground, that he might receive her in her descent. This maiden was just as she had started out of bed, the moon shone very bright, and a fresh breeze of wind blowing. None of Mrs. Winifred's beauties could possibly escape the view of the fortunate Clinker, whose heart was not able to withstand the united force of so many charms. At least I am much mistaken, if he has not been her humble slave from that moment. He received her in his arms, and, giving her his coat to protect her from the weather, ascended again with admirable dexterity. At that instant, the landlord of the house called out with an audible voice that the fire was extinguished, and the ladies had nothing further to fear. This was a welcome note to the audience, and produced an immediate effect. The shrieking ceased, and a confused sound of expostulation ensued. I conducted Mrs. Tabitha and my sister to their own chamber, where Liddy fainted away, but was soon brought to herself. Then I went to offer my services to the other ladies, who might want assistance. They were all scudding through the passage to their several apartments, and as the thoroughfare was lighted by 2 lamps, I had a pretty good observation of them in their transit, but as most of them were naked to the smock, and all their heads shrouded in huge nightcaps, I could not distinguish one face from another, though I recognized some of their voices. These were generally plaintive, some wept, some scolded, and some prayed. I lifted up one poor old gentlewoman, who had been overturned and sore bruised by a multitude of feet, and this was also the case with the lame person from Northumberland, whom Micklewhimmen had in his passage overthrown, though not with impunity, for the cripple, in falling, gave him such a good pelt on the head with his crutch, that the blood followed. As for this lawyer, he waited below till the hurly-burly was over, and then stole softly to his own chamber, from whence he did not venture to make a second sally till 11 in the forenoon, when he was led into the public room, by his own servant and another assistant, groaning most woefully, with a bloody napkin round his head. But things were greatly altered. The selfish brutality of his behavior on the stairs had steeled their hearts against all his arts and address. Not a soul offered to accommodate him with a chair, cushion, or footstool, so that he was obliged to sit down on a hard bench. In that position, he looked around with a rueful aspect, and, bowing very low, said in a whining tone, "Your most humble servant, ladies. Fire is a dreadful calamity." "Fire purifies gold, and it ties friendship," cried Mrs. Tabitha, bridling. "Yea, madam," replied Micklewhimmen, "and it trieth discretion also. If discretion consists in forsaking a friend in adversity, you are eminently possessed of that virtue," resumed our aunt. "Na, madam," rejoined the advocate, "well I wot, I cannot claim any merit from the mode of my retreat. Ye'll please to observe, ladies, there are TWA independent principles that actuate our nature. One is instinct, which we have in common with the brute creation, and the other is reason. No, in certain great emergencies, when the faculty of reason is suspended, instinct takes the lead, and when this predominates, having no affinity with reason, it pays no sort of regard to its connections, it only operates for the preservation of the individual, and that by the most expeditious and effectual means. Therefore, begging your pardon, ladies, I'm no accountable in foro conscientio for what I did, while under the influence of this irresistible puer." Here my uncle interposing, "I should be glad to know," said he, "whether it was instinct that prompted you to retreat with bag and baggage, for, I think, you had a portmanteau on your shoulder." The lawyer answered, without hesitation, "If I might tell my mind freely, without incurring the suspicion of presumption, I should think it was something superior to either reason or instinct which suggested that measure. And this on a twofold account. In the first place, the portmanteau contained the writings of a worthy nobleman's estate, and their being burnt would have occasioned a loss that could not be repaired. Secondly, my good angel seems to have laid the portmanteau on my shoulders, by way of defence, to sustain the violence of a most inhuman blow, from the crutch of a reverend clergyman, which, even in spite of that medium, hath wounded me sorely, even unto the pericranium. By your own doctrine, cried the parson, who chanced to be present, I am not accountable for the blow, which was the effect of instinct. I crave your pardon, reverend sir, said the other. Instinct never acts, but for the preservation of the individual, but your preservation was out of the case, you had already received the damage, and therefore the blow must be imputed to revenge, which is a sinful passion, that ill becomes any Christian, especially a Protestant divine, and let me tell you, most reverend doctor, gin I had a mind to plea, the law would hold my libel relevant. Why, the damage is pretty equal on both sides, cried the parson, your head is broke, and my crutch is snapped in the middle. Now, if you will repair the one, I will be at the expense of curing the other. This sally raised the laugh against mickle women, who began to look grave, when my uncle, in order to change the discourse, observed, that instinct had been very kind to him in another respect, for it had restored to him the use of his limbs, which, in his exit, he had moved with surprising agility. He replied, that it was the nature of fear to brace up the nerves, and mentioned some surprising feats of strength and activity performed by persons under the impulse of terror, but he complained that in his own particular, the effects had ceased when the cause was taken away. The squire said, he would lay a tea-drinking on his head, that he should dance a Scotch measure, without making a false step, and the advocate grinning, called for the piper, a fiddler being at hand. This original started up, with his bloody napkin over his black tie periwig, and acquitted himself in such a manner as excited the mirth of the whole company, but he could not regain the good graces of Mrs. Tabby, who did not understand the principle of instinct, and the lawyer did not think it worth his while to proceed to further demonstration. From Harrogate, we came hither, by the way of York, and here we shall tarry some days, as my uncle and Tabitha are both resolved to make use of the waters. Scarborough, though a paltry town, is romantic from its situation along a cliff that overhangs the sea. The harbour is formed by a small elbow of land that runs out as a natural mole, directly opposite to the town, and on that side is the castle, which stands very high, of considerable extent, and, before the invention of gunpowder, was counted impregnable. At the other end of Scarborough are 2 public rooms for the use of the company, who resort to this place in the summer to drink the waters and bathe in the sea, and the diversions are pretty much on the same footing here as at Bath. The spot is a little way beyond the town, on the side, under a cliff, within a few paces of the sea, and thither the drinkers go every morning in dishabille, but the descent is by a great number of steps, which invalids find very inconvenient. Betwixt the well and the harbour, the bathing machines are ranged along the beach, with all their proper utensils and attendants. You have never seen one of these machines. Image to yourself a small, snug, wooden chamber, fixed upon a wheel carriage, having a door at each end, and on each side a little window above, a bench below. The bather, ascending into this apartment by wooden steps, shuts himself in, and begins to undress, while the attendant yokes a horse to the end next the sea, and draws the carriage forwards, till the surface of the water is on a level with the floor of the dressing-room. Then he moves and fixes the horse to the other end. The person within being stripped, opens the door to the seaward, where he finds the guide ready, and plunges headlong into the water. After having bathed, he reascends into the apartment, by the steps which had been shifted for that purpose, and puts on his clothes at his leisure, while the carriage is drawn back again upon the dry land, so that he has nothing further to do, but to open the door, and come down as he went up, should he be so weak or ill as to require a servant to put off and on his clothes. There is room enough in the apartment for 6 people. The guides who attend the ladies in the water are of their own sex, and they and the female bathers have a dress of flannel for the sea. Nay, they are provided with other conveniences for the support of decorum. A certain number of the machines are fitted with tilts, that project from the seaward ends of them, so as to screen the bathers from the view of all persons whatsoever. The beach is admirably adapted for this practice, the descent being gently gradual, and the sand soft as velvet, but then the machines can be used only at a certain time of the tide, which varies every day, so that sometimes the bathers are obliged to rise very early in the morning. For my part, I love swimming as an exercise. and can enjoy it at all times of the tide, without the formality of an apparatus. You and I have often plunged together into the Isis, but the sea is a much more noble bath, for health as well as pleasure. You cannot conceive what a flow of spirits it gives, and how it braces every sinew of the human frame. Were I to enumerate half the diseases which are every day cured by sea bathing, you might justly say you had received a treatise, instead of a letter, from your affectionate friend and servant, J. Melford, Scarborough, July 1.